The airplane at the center of this story is not just another heavy bomber. It is an ecosystem of ideas that were difficult to conceive separately and even harder to make coexist inside one airframe. The B-29 Superfortress was designed to fly above the reach of most guns that had defined the previous war, to stay in the air for distances that made oceans feel narrower, and to carry a weight of explosives that forced enemy planners to rethink what rear area meant. Its wings were long, thick at the root, and deliberately clean, hiding fuel and plumbing inside a structure that preferred lift over drama. 4 massive Wright RE 3000, 350 duplex-A Cyclone engines gave the airplane the thrust and altitude margin it needed. But more important than raw power was the system wrapped around that power. Turbo superchargers and intercoolers sculpted the thin air at height into something the cylinders could use. When everything worked, the result was not merely speed but consistency, an ability to sustain crews where defenders ran short on both oxygen and options. Pressurization changed the rules for people, as much as supercharging changed them for engines. Instead of littering the sky with open waist windows and human figures braced behind their guns, the B-29 sealed its crew into 2 pressurized islands, connected by a narrow tunnel over the bomb bay. The nose compartment held the pilots, bombardier, navigator, radio operator, and the forward gunner's station. The rear compartment, behind the bomb bays, carried more gunners and the flight engineer's auxiliary panels. The tail remained unpressurized and was equipped with its own defensive position. This architecture was not a gimmick. It was endurance engineering, a way to keep minds lucid and fingers warm at altitudes where frostbite could shorten a mission even when enemy fire did not. Long-range navigation, consistent sighting, and any attempt to extract a second or third sortie from the same body in the same week all became more plausible because the air inside stayed human. Gunnery itself evolved from a set of local, individual reactions into a coordinated, centrally calculated act. The remote turrets hanging on the skin of the airplane's sleek domes with paired 50-caliber machine guns, some with an added 20mm punch depending on configuration, were not meant to be heroic platforms for a solitary gunner's grit. They were nodes in a network. The central fire control system used stabilized sights and analog computation to harmonize lead, elevation, and bullet fall across multiple stations, letting one crew member assign multiple turrets to a single threat or spread them across a formation of attackers. Instead of standing in the slipstream and guessing at deflection angles with numb hands, gunners sat within pressurized compartments, looking into sights that compensated for movement, temperature, and ballistics with mechanical logic. Many aircraft could claim to be faster or to carry more guns. The B-29's innovation was to let its guns act together with a calmness that belonged more to a plotting room than to a wind-blasted fuselage. None of this would have mattered without reach. The airplane's fuel system, divided among cavernous wing tanks and fed through carefully managed pumps, gave planners the confidence to launch from islands so far from the target that, a few years earlier, the mission would have looked like fiction. Range did more than increase options. It erased patterns. Defenders used to raids arriving from predictable directions now had to worry about paths bent by jet streams and altitudes that made radar operators question returns that looked too high to be practical. The B-29's operating ceiling sketched a new map on the air, one that veered around mountain ranges not by detouring, but simply by ignoring them. When people describe the airplane as a system of systems, it can sound like a slogan. Inside the metal, it was a daily struggle against friction, thermal, mechanical, and human. The RE 3000, 350, did not tolerate poor handling. Its heat had to be shepherded, its oil kept clean, and its cowl flaps positioned with respect for the thin line between cooling and drag. Pressurization demanded vigilance. A pinhole leak could cascade into fogging, ice, and noise that erased the advantage of height. The central fire control made gunnery more precise, but required training that felt more like a classroom than a gun pit. Every edge the airplane delivered to its crew depended on thousands of quiet choices made by mechanics, armorers, and pilots who were learning a new cadence of war. To describe what the airplane is also requires stating what it is not. It is not invulnerable. It is not a dream that arrived complete and flawless. It carried weighty compromises, an appetite for maintenance, and a temperament that punished carelessness. But compared to the bombers that had defined the recent past, it was a different order of thought. The stresses of a long fuselage were tamed with careful stringer and bulkhead placement. The bomb bays sat like lungs in the middle of the body, and a narrow tunnel, more like a ship's passageway than an aircraft catwalk, allowed people to move without giving the cold a door to come through. The radios were arranged so speech could cut through engine hum at height. The navigator's table was a workplace, not an afterthought. When one walks through the compartments, even in imagination, the impression is not of sheer size but of considered space. To understand how such an airplane could be captured, you must think less of flags and more of physics, less of banners planted and more of lines of force converging. A damaged engine runs hotter as the crew tries to coax it home. A fuel leak discovered too late becomes a weight imbalance that grows uglier with every minute. Weather adds malice, turning lift into doubt, and at the end of a calculus of degradations, a pilot commits to Earth that is not friendly because Earth is the only option left. The moment does not look like a ceremony. It looks like wheels finding a field that will not break them, or like belly skins skidding across a stretch of flattened grass that had been a village commons at sunrise and was a runway of necessity by noon. Captured, then, becomes a sequence. Impact, stillness, a crowd, a cordon, a decision. That decision opens the door to engineers. They approach with notebooks and quietly accumulated habits. Do not touch before measuring, photograph before cleaning, label before lifting. They did not expect magic. They expected, at most, better organization of familiar ideas. Their surprise, the silence that will arrive later, was not about discovering a single miraculous component hidden in the metal. It was about meeting a totality that behaved as if it had been designed by a single, patient mind rather than by committees pressed by deadlines. The B-29 is not an ornament of war. It is a workshop in the sky, and every bench inside seems to have the right tool already set out. This is the airplane as it exists in its own right, before it belongs to a moment, a place, or an audience. Its reality is technical, but its implications are human. It takes a certain kind of discipline to build it, and another kind to understand it. The story that follows will not sensationalize that discipline. It will simply show what happens when professionals, trained within a different philosophy of design and industrial practice, encounter the Superfortress not as a rumor high above contrails, but as a physical fact resting on the ground. They do not yet stand in silence. They are still walking toward the fuselage, boots making the same sound any boots make on tamped earth. They will look up at the smooth, ovoid nose. They will note the height of the tail, and they will squint into nacelles that look deeper than a single afternoon can comprehend. The silence will come, but for now there is a hum, tools unpacking, ladders being raised, a language of work beginning to be spoken. The day starts not with enemy contact, but with weather. In the early hours, a sheet of high cloud parks itself over the strait and then thickens into a tall, indifferent sky. A crew briefed for a long-range mission, already committed to the logic of fuel and distance, watches the ceiling as they taxi, trading glances with the men on the ground who have no authority over the air but know it better than anyone. The airplane lifts with grace and a human amount of apprehension. To fly far is to promise yourself to time as much as to destination. It is still dark when the last lights behind them turn to pinpricks. Dawn discovers them already becoming a line on a navigator's chart. At this point, the machine is simply doing what it was built to do: climb into temperatures that make metal brittle, lean on its superchargers, and settle into a cruise that is less about speed than about patience. The first change comes late in the morning, when a gauge begins to behave more like a suggestion than a measurement. A reluctant engine does not fail catastrophically. It first becomes conversational, asking for attention with a wobble of temperature, a flicker in pressure, a vibration that hides in the crew's bones, until the engineer points at the panel and breaks the spell with a calm report. They adjust mixture and RPM, they listen, they wait. 1,000 miles from comfort, any decision is an act of proportion rather than bravery. The airplane continues, but the crew now flies in a world narrowed to one question. Is this still within the plan? By early afternoon, the answer grows less certain. The engine behaves, then misbehaves. A student who knows what the teacher wants but cannot keep it together. The crew weighs diversion options. They are not over Europe, where choices stack like tiles, nor over the broad plains of a familiar continent, but over a geography that offers far fewer places to fall without consequence. A headwind stronger than forecast steals fuel in increments too small to matter until they add up to a large mistake. The navigator redraws arcs. The pilot feels the airplane's mood through the control column, that slight reluctance when a machine knows it is being asked for more than it would prefer to give. Late afternoon stretches shadows long enough to become warnings. The crew commits to a return, the turn home becoming not merely a change of heading, but a declaration that the mission's arithmetic has flipped into the red. The questionable engine, asked to deliver just a little more, answers with a cough and then a pattern of heat that no amount of cowl flap finesse can soothe. The airplane can stay in the air, but not in the mission. A second and then third variable begin to crowd the margin. Weather ahead at base, searchlights newly placed along an enemy coastline, a patchwork of fields that look flat from altitude but hide ditches, mounds, and fences in their green insistence. Near dusk, the reality crystallizes. A landing must be made soon and not on a prepared strip. The crew selects an area that, from 1,000 feet, looks like an invitation and, from 500, looks like a negotiation. The bomb bays are cleared as they have to be. Weight must be managed with the respect any flying machine demands when it comes close to the ground in doubt. In the radio compartment, someone writes a terse line that might reach someone friendly in time or might not. The navigator folds his map along a seam that will be meaningless in 5 minutes. The pilot lowers the nose enough to give the airplane a steadiness that feels like humility rather than defeat. The touchdown is not dramatic. It is serious. Wheels roll. A patch of rough grass catches the landing gear with the softness of a handshake, and then remembers it is earth, not pavement. The airplane bounces once, makes a noise that will live in the crew's ears for years, and then gives in to inertia with a slide that bends metal without destroying structure. The fuselage stays intact, the wings keep their patient shape, the tail remains upright like a flagpole, stubbornly refusing to acknowledge wind. The crew breathes in, breathes out, and begins the ritual of shutting down a machine that still tries to pretend it is in control. Stillness lasts for the length of a slow count to 60 before motion arrives from the edges. People who had watched the sky with daily curiosity become participants. A child runs until an adult catches the sleeve and turns the run into a walk. A few brave figures approach the airplane at an angle, as if unsure how far the fear inside the metal extends beyond the aluminum. Soon there are enough bodies to be called a crowd, and then enough authority to be called a cordon. Soldiers carve space out of noise with their hands and voices. A truck that will later be described as borrowed appears with a ladder. Lines are drawn physical, verbal, and then official. Night pulls itself over the scene like a blanket that cannot help but be thin. Lamps throw cones of yellow that look theatrical until tools appear inside them. The first decision is universal: secure the perimeter. The second is more intimate: protect the machine from itself. Fuel lines are checked. A battery disconnect that was designed for gloved hands in a tight compartment is found and pulled. The wings are touched as one touches an animal to let it know a human has arrived with intentions that are not hostile. Paperwork begins in parallel with work. Names are taken, dates noted. Distances estimated by people who are used to pacing fields. By midnight, the airplane has a guardian in the form of a small detachment that will later be replaced by a larger one. A telephone line carries words to a city where technical officials do not sleep as well as they claim. The next step is obvious: form an inspection team. They will arrive with a blend of authority and curiosity that tends to exist wherever engineers are asked to stand very close to weapons. Arrangements are made in a language that mixes duty with eagerness. If a vehicle cannot be procured, one will be improvised. If a truck is too small, several will become one in spirit by driving together. Dawn does not so much arrive as unveil what the lamps had sketched. The airplane looks larger in the morning, not taller or longer but denser, as if the light has mixed with the paint and the aluminum in a way that makes edges more honest. The crowd is thinner not because interest has faded, but because distance has been enforced. A team of men in the practical clothes of industry steps from a truck and looks in silence for a beat that is neither awe nor fear, but something adjacent to concentration. They see engines first, everyone always does, and then the nose, which has a certain confidence even when still. One of them carries a camera, another carries a coil of measuring tape. The day's work will begin with humility, because the machine does not care about the reputations of the people who will open it. By mid-morning of that second day, the airplane has surrendered nothing and everything. It is still a sealed object from a distance, but it has already changed the schedule of a bureau and the tone of a meeting. Men who thought they would be arguing over budgets are now looking up definitions in their minds: pressurization differentials, turbo machinery, analog computation. The incident has become an event, and the event is becoming a study. The timeline, which began with weather, has turned into a syllabus. The people who will write the notes that future readers will misinterpret as certainty have not yet written a word. They are too busy looking. Before the first panel comes off, the mind builds its own panel of numbers. Wingspan, large enough that the tips seem to sway with. The breeze even when the airplane is still. A length that suggests not just lift, but stability. Range, a reach that mocks the distance between islands and homelands, made possible not by a single large tank, but by a patient set of tanks and pumps that treat fuel as a living system rather than a passive cargo. Service ceiling, higher than the training many defenders received, high enough that breath becomes an engineering parameter, not merely a human one. Cruise and maximum speed, not unmatched in the world, but made strategically powerful by how often they can be repeated without tearing crews to pieces. Typical bomb load, a number that does not astonish by itself until the range and altitude are remembered, at which point it stops being a number and becomes a sentence. Then there is the skeleton made of metal and lines you cannot see without taking things apart. Spars carry the weight of the world with a competence that is almost boring, which is the best kind of competence. Stringers and frames give the fuselage its quiet strength. The skin is thin where it can be, thick where it must be, and curved in ways that let air slide without forming too many promises of drag. Control surfaces are balanced for the hands of the people who will move them for hours. Nothing in the cockpit suggests the job is supposed to be dramatic. Trim is emphasis, not rescue. The stick and throttles are tools that aspire to invisibility. Pressurization presents itself as seals, ducts, and gauges, but what it really is time converted into clarity. Crew endurance at extreme altitude is no longer a contest with numbness and oxygen starvation. It is a long state of alertness that lets other systems be used as designed. The nose and aft stations become small worlds, warm enough for fingers to keep their laws of motion. The tunnel over the bomb bay is a lesson in minimalism and intent. A narrow tube that admits a human shape and nothing superfluous. A passage that refuses to trade warmth for width. The tail, unpressurized, stands apart like a tiny nation that remains allied in war but keeps its own weather. The gunnery architecture, outwardly a few smooth blisters along the fuselage and back, has a logic that reveals itself in layers. At the heart is an idea less mechanical than philosophical. Let one mind coordinate the hands of many. Stabilized sights calm the trembling world so math can be applied to movement. Analog computers, the phrase has lost its poetry in a digital age, turn knobs and gyros into predictions that lead bullets to where an enemy will be. Turrets obey assignments that are not limited by where a single person can stand. The result is not an invincible shield, but something better, A predictable, repeatable defense that asks less of heroism and more of coherence. Power is the part that seduces first and then warns. The Ring 350 is a generous engine until it is not, a builder of altitude and an eater of maintenance hours. Turbo superchargers mounted outboard take the thin, indifferent air at height and turn it dense enough to feed the appetite of cylinders that would otherwise starve. Intercoolers tend to the heat born from compression. Oil moves like blood through channels that must remain clean. All of it has rhythms the engineers will try to feel with their hands, the vibration of a mount when a wrench is tapped against it, the harmonic stutter of a duct under a gust, the song a good engine sings when throttled just shy of its preferred note. The cockpit arranges authority in a way that makes sense when the world is doing its worst. The pilot's view is broad without being sentimental. The glass is there to ensure decisions, not scenery. The bombardier's office at the very front is not a place for glorified aim, but for calibration and timing. The navigator's table, with its lamps and charts, suggests a craft older than aviation and just as exacting. The radio's nest binds the airplane to people who do not have to fly to be necessary. Everything is where a hand expects it to be. Luxury, in this context, is defined as the absence of surprise. To call this a fast facts section is not to trivialize it, but to admit the human brain needs a spine to hang understanding on. Numbers and modules can be revisited while prose keeps moving. The engineers who have come to look will build their own spine as they go, converting foreign labels into concepts that fit their training. A wing route measured in millimeters becomes a conclusion about load paths. A supercharger impeller diameter becomes a sentence about altitude performance. A sight's reticle becomes a thought about the speed of approach angles. They will note the alloy's feel under a file, the way a seam resists probing, the behavior of paint around rivets where heat has lived. It would be easy to pretend that this is only a machine, that the conversation between the men and the metal is purely technical. But the numbers insist otherwise. Range is not only range. It is the distance over which a doctrine can be exercised. Ceiling is not only ceiling. It is the band of sky where your defenders stop being certain. Bomb load is not only load. It is the portion of your industry that must now be set aside to repair rather than to make. Speed is not only speed. It shifts timetables, resets alarms, and steals the leisurely pauses generals use to think before they answer the telephone. These facts, then, are not a list to memorize but a way to predict behavior. A defender who reads them correctly stops aiming where airplanes used to be and begins preparing for where this one will choose to live. Guns are moved, fuses altered, searchlights taught to reach higher with steadier hands. Pilots are trained to meet an enemy who declines to fight in the air that used to belong to both sides. The numbers argue for changing not just tactics but taste. The willingness to accept that elegance in design can be a weapon the way mass once was. The people around the airplane on this second morning do not say this out loud. They measure, they write, they sketch. But inside their heads a conversion is underway, turning measurements into an unwelcome respect. The spine for the mind is completed by the small things that almost never make it into grand descriptions, but always occupy the hands of those who must understand. A latch that closes with a click that suggests careful tolerances. A cable run that refuses to rub against a bulkhead because someone placed a tiny clamp at the right angle. A handhold where a hand would naturally reach after climbing a ladder in cold gloves. A maintenance panel whose screws are not arranged to frustrate the tired, but to welcome the efficient. The airplane communicates its intent through such things. It has been built by people who expected it to be used by people, over and over, in weather and in weariness. By the time the list of facts has been read for the fourth time, it no longer looks like a list. It looks like character. The Superfortress is not a brute trying to overpower the sky. It is a patient negotiator choosing where to meet it. Once that reality settles in, the engineers know their day will not be about finding a single secret worth stealing. It will be about mapping a philosophy across rivets and wires and glass, and admitting that the philosophy works. They came with a story already written in their heads, because people always do. The story went like this. At altitude, any bomber is a collection of vulnerabilities tied together by ambition. Pressurization is fragile. A nick in a seal or a cracked pane turns endurance into a race against numbness. Engines built for height run hot and mean. A little dust, a little neglect, and they punish you with sudden temper. Remote guns are for optimists. When the sky becomes a confusion of speed and angle, only a man braced at an open window can make the kind of intuitive correction that saves lives. The great airplanes of the war, under this story, are great not because they are coherent, but because they are brave. They survive by surviving. In the first hour of inspection, the story starts to fray. The pressurized nose is not a glass house waiting for the first stone, but a compact dwelling whose windows are thicker where they need to be, and whose joints look more like shipbuilding than like earlier bombers. The seals are not the brittle, fussy things of the engineer's imagination. They are forgiving within limits, easy to reach, obviously designed for replacement by people who do not have infinite time. The door hardware closes with a certainty that suggests it will do so reliably after hundreds of cycles. The oxygen system does not shout about itself with a tangle of hoses, but sits embedded like plumbing in a good building. They expect to find engines that hide their demands behind speed. They find engines that expose their needs in surfaces one can see and touch. The turbo supercharger installation is not mystical. It is complex, yes, but honest about its complexity. Ducts are smooth where turbulence would hurt. Junctions are shaped as if someone had the patience to test several versions and chose the one that felt like it belonged. Intercoolers occupy volumes that had been negotiated with the airframe as equals, not as afterthoughts. Every mount and brace whispers about vibration addressed before it became a problem. Heat shields look placed by people who had been burned once and preferred not to be burned again. They expect guns to be persuasive but clumsy, powerful but blind. What they find is a discipline. Sights built to stabilize an image when the world outside cannot be trusted to hold still. A networked logic that allows a decision about allocation to make sense, not just for the current second, but for the next several. Cables and wires are routed as if the airplane intends to be maintained under pressure to launch soon, not eloquently dismantled by a museum curator. The gun blisters are low on drama and high on function. A hand moving along their edges can tell they were sculpted to split air cleanly rather than satisfy an artist's eye. They expect, above all, to find an enemy that is lucky rather than good. Luck shows itself in patches and coincidences. Coherence shows itself in repetition. Walking along the wing, pausing at the same distances where brackets repeat, they realize they are seeing a pattern that has been respected across the airplane. A philosophy is at work that cares about the second and 100th airplane as much as about the first. This is not a prototype that wandered into the war by accident. It is a production machine meant to be made by the hundreds and used by thousands. Jigs and fixtures back at distant factories have left their fingerprints on how easy it is to remove a panel, how obvious it is to trace a line. As noon becomes afternoon, the men who had come prepared to scoff begin to perform a different ritual. They stop performing, they measure in silence, they pass tools to one another without comment. They write down not just lengths and diameters, but the order of operations a mechanic would follow to service a pump or replace a seal. Their questions become strangely respectful, not, "Why did they do this?" but "How did they train crews to do this so often?" That small shift of tense why to how contains the entire moral of the day. They are no longer hunting for a trick. They are trying to imagine the factory behind the airplane. It is not that they cannot point to flaws. The engine's reputation for temper tantrums is justified by what they see: tight thermal margins, a level of required cleanliness that feels like a dare, oil pathways that will clog if someone decides to save 5 minutes at the end of a night shift. Pressurization, for all its sensibility, still depends on human vigilance. A distracted hand can leave a latch half-caught. The computing, sites need calibration and care. But these are not indictment points. They are the prices paid for coherence. The airplane demands discipline because it offers endurance. It asks for training because it promises repeatability. It is not a magic trick. It is a contract. Late in the day, with light turning the aluminum into a material that looks liquid from certain angles, one of the engineers crawls through the tunnel over the bomb bay and emerges in the aft pressurized section. It is quieter there than he expects. He puts a hand on the floor and feels the hum of cooling metal, the small residual shivers that live in a structure after it has flown far and then settled. He looks at a panel and thinks of a technician miles away who knew, long before this inspection, that a human hand would rest exactly there. The thought arrives like weather. This airplane was not built against people, but for them, to keep them capable in a place where people usually become clumsy. The first undoing of expectation is not an argument won. It is a mood lost. The men who came to catch the enemy praising its luck find themselves describing competence. They came to enumerate weak points and instead begin to map workflows. They arrived ready to call the airplane a museum of over-engineering and leave calling it a school of integration. None of them says the word that will title this story. That will wait for the day when they step back at the end of a longer inspection and realize that what defeats them is not secrecy but scale, not a hidden device but the unfashionable strength of things done properly many times in a row. For now, as dusk slides toward night again and lamps reclaim their small territories of light, they are quiet, for reasons that will be clear later. They have the beginnings of an answer to a question they had not known to ask. What would it take to meet this airplane on its own terms? Not just once, but every week, every month, across seasons and across a war. The calculation does not live in an equation. It lives in factories, schools, maintenance depots, training curricula, and in a culture that lets a problem be solved before it turns into a crisis. They do not yet stand in total silence. But the ground is being prepared for it, piece by measured piece, as the shape of the B-29 becomes less a captured object and more a mirror they did not expect to be handed. Morning light lifts the last thin veil of night from the aluminum and turns the airplane from an outline into an object again. The men who waited through the cold step forward with the hesitant confidence of people who respect thresholds. They have stood near bombers, crawled through fighters, and diagrammed everything from floats to flaps. But a pressurized aircraft is not simply another fuselage. It is a building that flies, with walls that must keep a climate alive, while the world outside tries to strip it away. The first door opens with a weight that belongs to ships more than to earlier airplanes. The handle moves through its arc and the seal relents, not all at once but in a careful surrender as the latches walk open. A breath of interior air slips out. It does not smell like mystery. It smells faintly of oil that has warmed and cooled many times, of canvas and rubber, of electric varnish that remembers current. Someone places a wedge so the door cannot swing shut. In a pressurized airplane, even habits become architecture. Inside the nose compartment, the first impression is not size but order. Corners are rounded where elbows would otherwise bruise. The glazing forward is faceted with purpose, thicker where force concentrates, slightly bowed where the wind's hand will press hardest. The bombardier's station is nested like a craftsman's bench. The sighting equipment sits in a place that has been chosen by experience rather than by romance, at a height that keeps the back straight when the mission is long. When fingers trace the metal edge of the shelf, they find a softened lip that will not cut even when hands are clumsy with gloves. An engineer crouches beside the navigator's table and does not measure the width or depth of the work surface first. He measures the reach from chair to chart lamp, the angle at which the radio headset cable naturally falls, the way the pencil tray is canted to discourage rolls in turbulence. Ergonomics is a new word on many tongues, but here it becomes visible, a grammar of use that insists on sentences made of motions rather than of words. The seals that hold the air are neither delicate nor crude. They are firm bands of material seated into channels cut with the seriousness of a watertight door. When the inspectors press a thumbnail into the elastomer, it yields and then recovers with a speed that suggests a life designed in cycles, hundreds and thousands of closures without complaint. Around the frames there are witness marks, tiny scuffs that say the door has been used often, not handled as a relic. Where the glazing meets metal, someone has been generous with fasteners, not for show but because a pressurized life hates looseness. The hinges are not an afterthought. Each hinge leaf spreads load into the surrounding structure like roots. The pins look too simple to be critical until you imagine replacing one at night by flashlight in a cold wind. Then their very simplicity feels like mercy. They look for weakness by asking where air might choose to escape. Ducts are mapped by hand and by eye. A panel near the floor is opened, revealing the hidden life of pipes and wires passing through glands that bite them gently, just hard enough to hold pressure where it belongs. The temperature control system is modest in appearance and ambitious in effect. Heaters sit where air can pick up warmth efficiently, and baffles direct flow to keep the forward compartment a place for thinking rather than for suffering. The engineers know from experience that a warm crew makes fewer errors than a shivering one. They find the signs that someone else knew the same thing without declaring it on a placard. Insulation tucked where it will do the most good for the least weight, soundproofing that turns the thrumming of 4 engines into a background rather than a tyrant. The tunnel that leaps the bomb bay is narrower than imagination would prefer, but the body recognizes its adequacy, the way a sailor recognizes a ladder, not generous, but right. A man on his elbows and knees can move through without scraping knuckles if he keeps his mind on the task. The structure around the tunnel is confident, as if the airplane knows this small bridge must survive not only flight loads but also the bumps of boots and the drag of clothing. The engineers take turns in the passage and each emerges with a slightly different memory of the sound in there. The air's hush broken only by echoes of breath. Someone remarks, not out loud but to himself, that this is why the forward and aft stations feel like separate apartments in the same building. The separation is a gift, not a division, a way to keep 2 groups alert by giving them their own weather. At the aft pressurized compartment the tone changes subtly. It is less theatrical than the nose and more domestic. Remarkably little space is wasted on dominance. Everything visible asks for maintenance rather than admiration. Tool access points are arranged with a frankness that betrays factory thinking. You can imagine a line worker installing them and, in the same gesture, imagining the crew who will later undo what he has done for the sake of service. There are doors where doors should be, panels where panels will earn their keep, and stowage that proves someone had lived with clutter and decided against it. Nothing begs to be photographed, and everything insists on being used. Glass is a story of its own. The forward panels are things of strength first, and clarity second. Where 2 panes meet, the joint is not the weak smile of a compromise but a handshake. The mounting rings that accept them show a generosity of thickness where force is known to gather. The inspectors note the mixture of screws and bolts and sense the quiet law. Use the smallest thing that works for a long time, and use the larger thing only where time is crueler. This law appears again at the frames, where edges are rolled rather than left sharp, protecting both material and flesh. Outside, the world will claw at this nose with cold and with pressure that wants to be equal. Inside, the atmosphere will remain domestic, a place where a pencil can be set down without skittering away. They catalogue the quiet provisions for emergencies. An escape panel offers promises without boasting. A fire extinguisher sits in reach of more than 1 pair of hands. The oxygen system's redundancies are evident in the branching of lines and in the presence of gauges that can be read from more than one stance. The radio cabling is routed with a preference for surviving small insults. It does not cross sharp edges, and where it must pass near a hinge it does so with a protected sweep that will not become a frayed confession after months of use. The lighting is diffuse enough to spare eyes at night and focused enough to do fine work. These are not luxuries but the deliberate kindnesses that keep crews from turning small difficulties into large ones. A visitor who has never flown would be forgiven for thinking the cockpit glamorous, with its windows and its throne-like seats. To someone who knows flight, glamour is the absence of things that make life harder. The throttle quadrant is positioned not to impress, but to be reached without thought. The mixture and propeller controls sit where hands can move along a remembered path in the dark. The instrument arrangement respects the rhythm of scan, not the whims of decoration. It will remain readable when the air outside wrinkles with turbulence, and when human hearts beat faster. Cooling flaps, boost controls, and pressurization indicators form a conversation rather than a jumble. The entire arrangement teaches the same lesson. This place was made to be learned, and once learned, to be lived in. What surprises the inspectors most is not any single device, but the way so many small accommodations add up to an environment. A different kind of airplane would make the crew fit itself to the machine. This one has made a broad effort to fit itself to the crew within the cruel limits that flight imposes. That generosity does not make the machine gentle. It makes it exacting in a human way. To maintain pressurization, you must close what must be closed and check what must be checked. To keep air warm, you must accept that heat has a budget. To sit at these stations, you must think not only of your task, but of the tasks occurring 3 meters away through a tunnel and a door. The technology asks for attention, and in return it multiplies what attention can do. When the men step back from the compartments and breathe the air by the open hatch, their notes look almost ordinary. Measurements in millimeters, material guesses, sketches with arrows that show direction of flow. Their faces tell a different story. The place they just explored is not a mere chamber in a weapon. It is a workplace of modernity, an argument in metal that says long missions can be made routine if one invests in people's comfort as aggressively as one invests in engines. They have touched a design philosophy, and philosophy, once touched, is difficult to forget. The door is closed for the moment, and the seal receives its load once more. The airplane looks as it did an hour earlier, a polished ellipsoid at the nose and a tail that cuts the sky. But the interior now lives inside the engineers' heads as a kind of blueprint of behavior. The inspection moves on, but from now on every discovery will be seen through this lens of considered use. The moment comes without ceremony. A sighting station is energized from the aircraft's system, and its world steadies, as if the air outside had agreed to stop trembling. The glass that the operator looks through is not a window into fantasy. It is a map of math placed on the moving sky. In older machines, gunnery is the sum of individual boldness plus chance. Here, the individual mind is amplified by a device that insists motion can be predicted and that a bullet's travel through air is not a guess, but a problem with a solvable shape. The men take turns at the eyepiece and feel the counterintuitive peace that comes from a stabilized field of view. It is not the peace of safety. It is the calm of knowing the world can be measured even when you are afraid. The turrets outside answer to this calmness. They are low and tidy, their arcs of motion unobstructed, their placements the result of someone having drawn zones of fire on paper until the overlaps made sense. Each housing holds its paired guns like tools in a case, as if the airplane were telling you that symmetry can be a weapon. Power drives obey, not with the frantic urgency of a machine trying to impress, but with the patient authority of one that has time. When the operator slews the sight, distant metal acknowledges with a movement that looks smooth from the ground and feels inevitable from within. There is noise, of course, but it is the noise of certainty rather than of flailing. No one in the compartment claims that a calculating box can aim better than a practiced man under all conditions. What the device does, and does each time without complaint, is remove a layer of panic from the act. Inputs have names and places to enter. Target range, speed, angle of approach, the variables that once darted around a gunner's head like startled birds settle into perches inside the instrument. When the airframe shakes, gyros maintain their small, implacable insistence on straightness and level, transforming chaos into data. A sight that remembers its orientation can cooperate with a turret that remembers its last position. Together they build a bridge between intention and trajectory. The engineers understand too well what it costs to make such insistence reliable in the real world. They see redundancy, access panels that will forgive the clumsy hand of a midnight fix, harnesses that are labeled not for a museum but for a soldier who has an hour to swap a component and then sleep. The revelation is not how futuristic the system feels. It is how properly terrestrial it remains. Levers and cams and resistors, enclosed against dust and handled by connectors that do not pretend to be smarter than they are. come together like a small factory that happens to travel inside a bomber. The brain of the arrangement does not sit in one gilded box. It is distributed, so a wound in one place does not paralyze the whole body. The site can assign multiple turrets to a single threat, making the aircraft momentarily less a vehicle and more a coordinated battery. Or it can split attention, allowing guns to talk to different pieces of sky without tripping over each other's speech. The men tracing the lines on schematic plates realize they are reading an ethics of design. Make the operator's work legible. Privilege clarity over cleverness. Prefer systems that degrade gracefully when hurt. They think in stories because stories are how people remember. Consider the interceptor who dives from the rear quarter with a closing speed that turns seconds into fractions. In an older world, the gunner must guess a lead angle in a shaking frame, while the pilot flies a separate battle. Here, the sight calms the picture, computes lead with an uncomplaining patience, and the assignment logic allows more than one turret to meet the threat. Consider a head-on pass, the most frightening geometry, where the world turns into a coin tossed toward you at speed. The coordination ensures that what can bear does bear, and that the rest does not swing late and waste movement. In both cases, the airplane reduces the role of luck without erasing it. It takes talent and multiplies it. It takes fatigue and divides it. The inspectors examine the method by which power is taken and returned. The drives are not the ilk that demand constant coaxing. They were chosen for behavior, as much as for specification. They do not overshoot and sway back. They arrive and hold. Bearings are sized for lives that include grit and sudden weather. Cables are dressed along paths that make sense to fingers first, to classrooms second. At junction boxes, the labels are either clear or will be made clear with chalk and paint by crews who take pride in not getting lost in a tangle when minutes matter. Near the mounts, there are small marks that tell stories about recoil and about the hundreds of rounds that have passed through this metal before today. The stories agree. Stability here is not a theory. It is a history. A skeptic could say that all this amounts to the same old thing with a nicer chair. The men in the compartment know better. They look at the way the operator's hands move less and see the real prize. Time. A second saved from wrestling a sight is a second invested in watching a second attacker, or in calling out a bearing that helps the pilot keep the airplane in its best attitude for defense. When several stations share the same truth about the target, fewer rounds are wasted talking past one another. Ammunition becomes not merely carried but curated. Bursts are shorter, corrections smaller, hits more likely to matter. In a long mission, every conservation becomes cumulative. What is saved at noon is still available at dusk. Outside, the turret domes shine in the midday light, and their transparency reads like modesty rather than exhibition. The engineers circle them, check clearances with the casual eye of men who can imagine the bitter grin of a turret that snags on a fairing under stress. They find the absence of such petty traps reassuring. The feed chutes admit inspection without acrobatics. The ammunition boxes sit where gravity and reach make sense. Ejection paths do not threaten the aircraft's own skin. Maintenance is a choreography that a pair of professionals can learn and then perform without shouting. In war, the highest compliment you can pay a system is to say, "It is teachable." This one is. They end the day by staging a small rehearsal. Without ammunition and without any danger except to pride, a sight station assigns a turret, tracks a moving object across the field, and hands off gracefully to its neighbor. No one cheerfully declares perfection. They do not need to. The demonstration has justified its cost in cables and weight by doing the simplest, rarest thing. It has worked the same way twice. That regularity is an emotional event as much as a technical one. It is the difference between saying a prayer over every target and doing a job you can predict. When the power is cut and the machine goes quiet, a new respect has been minted and distributed among the watchers. They will sleep, and when they dream of the sky, it will be a little steadier than it was the night before. Engines draw attention the way hearths do, with heat and promise, and a murmur that suggests safety until it doesn't. 4 nacelles stand like guarded doors along the wing. each with its own rituals, each a country with laws. The inspectors begin at the inboard pair, not because they are easier, but because the wing route behind them offers a comfort of structure you feel through your boots. Panels come away with deliberate consent. Hinges hold where they should and detach where they must. Inside, the first impression is crowding, the second is organization. The engine at the center is a large and fallible friend, the Wright duplex cyclone, a ring of cylinders wrapped around a crankcase like worshippers around a fire. The turbo supercharger installation sits further back, like a bellows that feeds oxygen to a dragon. Pipes braid between them with a confidence that speaks of long arguments settled in favor of flow. The men have heard all the stories about temper. They too have cursed engines that run hot because designers advertised heights at which air is too thin to agree. Here they discover not a boast but an admission, expressed in aluminum and steel. Baffles turn chaos into a ducted stream that knows where to go. Cowl flaps are large enough to matter and subtle enough not to ruin the wing's promise. Intercoolers do the unglamorous work of making compressed air less angry before it enters the cylinders. Oil coolers guard the blood of the machine against desert and thunderhead alike. Everywhere, heat has been imagined as an adversary that can be managed if you are willing to think about it before it arrives. They trace the fuel's journey with fingers and with eyes. Tanks feed selectors that speak a plain language of options. Cross-feed arrangements confess their intent to be used when symmetry fails and when a good engine must be paid for by one that is becoming unreliable. Filters sit where the tired mechanic can reach them without knocking his knuckles silly on some proud boss. Lines are bracketed away from excitations that would rub holes into them under vibration. At junctions, the clamps are neither grudging nor foolishly tight. Someone designed for the day after installation, when the airplane belongs to people who must love it, and who will sometimes, humanly, love it in a hurry. The supercharger is not a gizmo. It is a seriousness. The impeller's diameter, the casing's shape, the way the flow enters and leaves without hard corners, all these try to tell the same story. We were built to make thin air useful without boiling it into trouble. Loitering near the ducting, a listener can hear echoes of the missions that justify this complexity. Without this steady gift of dense air, the airplane would be one more bomber bracketed by guns that live in the lower sky. With it, the aircraft rises above much of the flak and the lethal reach of ordinary interceptors, forcing defenders to climb into a band where machines gasp and where humans ask more of their bodies than they should on a weekday. Propellers are the visible wrists of the power plant's handshake with the world. The blades are not merely big. They are shaped with a confidence that comes from wind tunnel time and from pilots' complaints met and solved. Feathering gear turns a crippled prop into a quiet spoon against the wind when an engine fails, a gift of drag reduction you only appreciate when you have tried to nurse a wounded aircraft home. Governors hold RPM like a promise during climbs that test everything, and during descents when speed wants to run away with the airplane. There is elegance in this managed spin that the casual viewer never notices because it is busy making flight look easy. Of course there are faults. The engine likes its oil the way a musician likes a tuned instrument. Let it foul and it will throw tantrums at altitude. Drag a takeoff and abuse temperatures, and it will repay you with detonation that eats power like rust eats metal. The wiring must be kept clean, connections tight, and magnetos treated as the sacred hearts they are. The cowling, opened carelessly, will punish with warped edges that never quite seal again. A careless hand with a rag can introduce lint that later becomes a blockage, that later becomes a small fire, that later becomes a large one. None of this is hidden by design. The airplane assumes an adult relationship with its keepers. I will tell you what I need. In return, you will act like you heard me. The most humbling moments in the nacelles are also the most practical. A mount shows the faint, honest smear of rubber that has been doing its job of isolating vibration from the wing. A safety wire gleams and then vanishes into a bolt head drilled for exactly this tiny, crucial ritual. A drain. Line ends where it will not splash an exhaust or paint a tire with oil. A handhold exists where an arm will need it 3 hours into a maintenance evolution when the back begins to complain. The men who work here are being spared little, and yet are being spared everything that does not need to hurt. It is as if the machine's designers had made a list of avoidable miseries and set out to delete them one by one. From an altitude of ideas, all of this comes together as honest power. When the airplane climbs into the jet stream's edges and finds the air colder than the day can remember, the engines keep giving as long as you feed them correctly and as long as you do not mistake stubbornness for skill. When the mission stretches thin and fatigue nibbles at judgment, the systems offer the mercy of predictability. The inspector, who has crawled through the inboard and outboard nacelles, who has wiped his hands on a rag that came away with a clean sort of dirt, feels a pressure in his chest that is not only respect. It is a dawning comprehension of the infrastructure required to build and sustain such regularity. You cannot copy the engine without copying the world that makes the engine survivable. You could steal a blueprint, but the blueprint would demand factories and training, fuels and oils, and a faith in process that becomes its own kind of industry. When the panels close again, the nacelles look serene, their lines swallowed back into the wing's larger shape. The airplane is once more the sum of clean curves and polished fasteners. The heat that leaked into the day while everything was open slowly dissolves, and the scent of warmed metal becomes memory. The inspectors step down from their ladders more slowly than they climbed, not because of age, but because gravity feels heavier when thoughts are heavy. They have looked into the heart of the airplane and found neither sorcery nor sloppiness. They have found an honest machine that keeps its promises if you keep yours. By the third day, the airplane's skin has more chalk marks than it did, and the notebooks have more pages turned down at the corner. What the men have seen is rich, but richness can become a swamp if one lacks a path across it. The team leader, less by rank than by temperament, suggests a pause not to rest but to order. They stand at the edge of shade beside the wing and decide how to read what they have read. This too is part of understanding a machine, to separate facts which have hard edges from stories which often don't. The pause is not bureaucratic, it is moral. To lie to yourself about what you have learned is a greater failure than to learn slowly. They begin with the tangible, serial numbers stamped into plates and into the small defiant stiffness of steel tell a genealogy that photographs will later misremember, if not recorded now. The airframe number lives in one location, duplicated in another, because people who build airplanes know that labels fall off. Subassemblies carry their own identities, some clear as day, others smeared by heat or time. The team puts these down in ink without commentary, because numbers will be themselves tomorrow as well as today. Measurements follow and are treated the same way. A spar cap width, a rib pitch, a duct diameter, their reality does not depend on a good night's sleep. Next comes the class of evidence that pretends to be simple but isn't. Photographs. The camera suffers from two kinds of treachery, inaccuracy and seduction. A lens can distort and lighting can lie. Worse, a picture can charm the mind into thinking it has seen more than it has. The men adopt a discipline. Every photograph is taken with a scale in frame. Every angle repeats a previous angle when the subject demands before and after comparison. Every exposure is logged with place and time, not because the present needs it, but because the future will. They admit that photographs taken by others are not to be hated or worshipped. They are to be dated if possible, doubted if necessary, and used exactly to the extent that they can be tied to things under their own hands. Memory is the most dangerous instrument of all. Veterans and civilians alike will speak. Some will have stood close, others will have stood near people who stood close, and later convinced themselves that they were closer. The team resolves to hear everyone, and to believe no one without help. A recollection that matches a number is promoted to a fact. A recollection that matches nothing is kept beside the notes as a candidate, marked so it will not sneak into certainty by loitering in the same notebook. They do not despise stories. Machines create stories the way fires create smoke. They simply refuse to inhale until they know what is burning. Documents are the next layer of weather to be navigated. Official forms have the virtue of being bureaucratic, which is to say they are boring and therefore harder to falsify well. They also have the vice of being written by people in a hurry. A time stamped here may have been a time scribbled there, and the transposition between those places can breed error. The men choose to trust documents as a species, but to verify each individual like a suspect. When a logbook says a panel was removed at an hour and a place, and the witness marks agree, and a photograph shows the light likely to have looked that way, then a narrative acquires a shelf to rest on. With the classes of evidence ranked by temperament rather than by prejudice, the team turns to claims circulating beyond the fence line. The town, the garrison, and the wider rumour lanes have supplied an anthology of certainty. The bomber was flyable. The bomber was ready to explode. The bomber was new. The bomber was old. The bomber's guns were guided by a radio brain. The bomber's guns were frozen in place. The crew bailed out while singing. The crew vanished in the night. These are not malicious in themselves. They are people's attempts to include themselves in an event. The discipline is to let none of them outrun the footprints on the ground. If the guns move under power now, if the batteries hold charge, if a line leads from here to there without damage, then those parts of the anthology get their pages torn out and placed into the bin marked comforting illusions. If the fuel reeks too strongly of exposure to air, if the oil carries a signature of heat that suggests a fight for survival, then other pages get torn out and placed with a different label. They turn finally to themselves, because investigators become their own source of error as soon as they begin to believe they are immune. Each man subjects his notes to another man's impatience. Redundancies are revealed. Gaps appear. A dimension recorded in inches on one page competes with the same dimension recorded in millimeters on another. They reconcile. They accept that pride is the enemy of truth in the same way that fatigue is the enemy of craftsmanship. What survives this internal audit is not beautiful. It is merely reliable, and reliability is the only beauty that will help anyone here. The act of sorting signal from noise changes the tone of the camp around the airplane. Fewer sentences begin with, "I think," more with, "we can show." A drawing made the first day with enthusiastic lines is remade on the third, with fewer, cleaner strokes. The paradox is pleasant. Cutting away what does not stand up to proof makes the remaining body of knowledge feel bigger, because every part of it can bear weight. At night, the talk shifts from claims about what the airplane is to plans for what to do with what is known. You can move a gun here, raise a fuse height there, alter the climb profile of an interceptor, redesign a heater valve to match the idea you have seen. The men sleep better, not because they are closer to comfort, but because they are closer to honesty. This practice will become, in future tellings, a small legend about the day professionals refused to be seduced by the drama of a captured machine and chose the plainer victory of understanding. The airplane has not changed in these hours. It has simply become harder to lie about. The team packs their cameras, caps their ink, and step away from the wing with all the humility that machines deserve. The next phase will be harder because it will ask them to convert comprehension into action. But action without comprehension is motion, and motion without meaning is a way of losing wars. The light declines. The lines they have drawn in their notebooks do not. They will still be straight in the morning. By the fourth morning, a crowd of stories is waiting at the fence line just as surely as the sentries are. Stories multiply wherever a rare machine meets an anxious city. They deserve hearing, and they demand testing. The first insists that the bomber was flyable the instant it touched down, a trapped falcon that could have leapt back into the air if only fuel and courage had been added. The metal offers another tale. Skin ripples where the ground chose to remind the aircraft it is Earth. A gear door bears a bruise that no amount of optimism can massage flat. In the nacelles, heat signatures written in varnish and oil tell of an engine nursed beyond its patience. The airplane is intact enough to teach and too wounded to perform. Another claim speaks in a low conspiratorial tone. A hidden brain guided the guns, a radio-born intelligence that reached out to strike on its own. The system inside shrugs at such romance. What governs the turrets is logic more admirable because it is human-legible stabilized sites, analog computation, disciplined assignment. Wires link stations not to a wizard in a box but to one another. The wonder here is not sorcery but repeatability. What a good crew can do once, they can do again after practice, and that is the kind of miracle machines are meant to deliver. A favorite exaggeration dresses itself as praise. This single airframe could be copied, bolt for bolt, and turned against its makers within months. The inspectors, who have now lived with the airplane as one lives with a puzzle, know how far that hope runs ahead of the road. Drawings can be made, dimensions can be recorded, alloys can be tasted by file and torch, but every part leads the mind back to places not present. A factory that holds tolerances on hot days and cold, a training syllabus that turns wary hands into confident ones, depots that keep parts flowing in the right directions. The airplane does not exact tribute only in aluminum. It collects in habits. There are darker tales. Someone swears the crew was found singing defiantly, another that they vanished like smoke. The documents offer their smaller poetry. Times entered, distances paced, objects collected and labelled, mud on a boot heel that matches mud on a step, a torn strap whose threads agree with the scuffs on a rail. These are not cinematic, which is precisely why they satisfy. The human pieces are preserved without needing embroidery. The men were here, tired and skilled and fallible, and then they were elsewhere, as the tides of war move people like sand. The last myth is the most flattering to those doing the looking, that the inspection itself can extract certainty. Instead, they find a shape made of probabilities that grow sturdier with each cross-check. A photograph matched to a serial, a measurement matched to a manual leaf, a testimony matched to a nick on a handle truth accrues the way frost does, slowly, and then everywhere. By the time the day ends, what remains is smaller than rumour and larger than conjecture. It is the story the machine will allow. Understanding the airplane is a technical act. Possessing it is administrative, logistical, and political. The first hours answer to the nearest uniform, able to draw a line in the dust and say who may cross. That local custody is a bridge, not a destination. A telegram climbs a ladder of offices until it finds the desk where responsibility for rare metal rests. The answer comes back carrying both curiosity and constraint. Secure, document, exploit, move. Each verb has a cost measured in men, trucks, and hard choices about what cannot travel. The team drafts a plan that reads, at first glance, like a chore list, and at second, like a map of risks. What can be removed without harming what must be learned later? Which panels are knowledge and which are merely lids? Fuel is decanted under guard, and with the caution due to a fluid that turns thoughtless minutes into tragedies. Weapons are safed because no lesson is worth an accident. Wheels that touched a field not meant for them are inspected as if they were witnesses. A perimeter becomes paperwork, and paperwork becomes chain of custody. Signatures, dates, witness marks on crates, photographs of faces and handholds. Beyond the fence, priorities jostle. The army wants intelligence. It can turn into better interception. The air arm wants doctrine. The factories want samples. The scholars of materials want shavings and spectra. Transport officers, whose empires are built from scheduling and willpower, want to know why every request weighs more than the truck that must carry it. Compromise is the unglamorous hero of the day. A turret can be shipped. A wing cannot. A sight can ride in a crate padded with blankets taken from barracks. A spar has to remain where it is and be measured like a mountain. Even the decision to leave the airframe in place for days is not merely prudence, it is strategy. Moving too soon breaks the context in which the machine tells the truth about itself. Scuffs vanish under straps. Alignments shift under jacks. What was once an answer to a question about impact becomes a question about who tightened, which bolt on which morning. Waiting is not delay, it is method. When the time does come, it comes with labor that looks like patience. In motion ladders and rollers, slings settled at points that load the structure kindly, weights guessed and then refined by feel. In rooms far from the field, the event grows footnotes. Orders are framed to satisfy rules written after previous embarrassments. The habit of documentation becomes a habit of self-defense. No one wants a year to pass, and an inquiry to ask why a drawing is missing, a number or a crate, a signature. The men on the ground sense this distant pressure and translate it into care. If a bracket is removed, its screws sleep in a bag labelled with the bracket's language. If a panel corners with a quirk, that quirk is sketched so that the next hands will not strip a thread where none was meant to bear load. In this way, governance ceases to be a nuisance and becomes a shield for the truth they are trying to keep intact. When the convoy finally pulls away with sights and instruments, with samples and copies, with photographs, and the memory of a smell that will remind them of warmed aluminum for years, the airplane that remains is smaller in inventory and taller in stature. What cannot move has been fixed in drawings and in minds. Custody has done what custody is meant to do, turn an accident of geography into an archive of understanding. It arrives between sentences. A remark about the reach of a supercharger is halfway to being said when it is not said. A hand that meant to tap a panel with a knuckle for the familiar sake of sound decides not to. The engineers have walked the length of the fuselage one more time, not hunting anything new, merely paying respect to what they already know, and the cumulative fact of it removes language the way altitude removes heat. The airplane is not larger than yesterday, it is simply more itself. The pressurized doors with their patient hinges, the tunnel over the bomb bay that turns hardship into passage, the nacelles that confess both power and price, the sight that makes motion a choreographed thing, all these have been seen, measured and argued over. What has changed is the men. They are not afraid. Fear is noisy. This is the hush that announces comprehension. Each small kindness built into the machine has revealed a corresponding demand. If you would defend against this aircraft, you must climb higher with a steadier hand and learn to fight in thinner air. If you would copy it, you must copy the invisible parts of a nation that make such a thing possible. The consistency that lives in shops and schools. The willingness to turn training into a habit rather than an emergency. If you would simply respect it, you must admit that respect, like altitude, has a cost in breath. One of them stands beneath the wing where the spar passes from one world to another and listens to a silence that is not empty. It contains the memory of tools finding torque, of inspectors looking at witness marks and signing their names, of pilots learning to trust graphs more than hunches. He realizes that the aircraft's greatest strength is neither speed nor height but coherence. The parts do not excuse each other, they tutor each other. The guns are better because the cabin is warm enough for thought. The engines are worth their trouble because the wing deserves the lift they buy. The navigator's table earns its lamp because the mission will be long enough to need a map you can read without squinting. The others feel versions of the same thought and do not interrupt it with talk. They stand as workers do at the end of a long day when the thing on the bench has stopped being a puzzle and has become a companion. The tail cuts a slice of sky that will darken into evening if they permit it. Boots scrape quietly. A pencil closes a notebook without a snap. No one salutes. No one poses. When they finally step away, it is not a retreat but a yielding, the way one backs from a shrine without turning one's back to it until the last step makes turning natural again. The silence breaks itself, not with clamour, but with the soft common sounds of work resuming. But the men will remember that space where words felt like mistakes. After the convoy, and the quiet decisions took on the straightforward tone that follows a complicated lesson. Interception profiles were revised in unglamorous increments. Climbs begun earlier, at shallower angles that kept engines in their happy range. Attack bands lifted to altitudes previously treated as theory. Head-on passes practiced until the timing stopped being a rumor and became muscle. Searchlights were trained higher, crews drilled to hand off targets without the panicked overlaps that waste light. Fuses were adjusted. Ammunition mixes were reconsidered with an eye to the heights where fragments behave differently. None of this felt dramatic. All of it was change. On the ground, what could be copied quickly was copied. A valve arrangement that made maintenance kinder found a home in another shop. A routing trick that protected a cable from a hinge inspired a small redesign elsewhere. Hands learned, and once hands learn, they teach each other without waiting for orders. These were victories measured in fewer curses heard after midnight in hangars, in fewer bandages around fingers that had met sharp edges that no longer existed. What did not change was the arithmetic of distance and the economics of discipline. The airplane's range remained what it was, a geometry problem solved with fuel and weight and patience that could not be negated by cleverness alone. Its ceiling remained a climate that punishes the hurried and the careless. The central fire control remained a truth about coordination. Talent organized will beat talent flung against the wind. Factories could not be conjured, nor schools, nor a culture of repetition that turns a hard task into a normal day. You cannot shortcut a habit and hope it still acts like one. The men who had done the looking found themselves consulted more often. They spoke plainly. The lesson was not to worship the captured machine or to despair at its excellence. It was to let it set the standard for seriousness. If a heater valve could be placed where a tired hand would thank you, place yours there. If an access panel could benevolently align itself before the last screw is seated, design yours so it does. If a gun sight could make a frightened second feel like an orderly one, build your instruments with the same courtesy toward human limits. In this way, admiration became method. The story ends where all honest stories of machines end, with people. The B-29 returned to the sky in other hands and other colors, and the war continued to translate skill and steel into outcomes. But for a set of days in a place that now lives mostly on maps, a group of engineers met a flying argument about how to think. They judged it with the only fair measure whether its pieces kept their promises to one another and found themselves quiet in the face of such agreement. What changed next were the parts of their world that could be turned by a wrench. What did not change was the sky, which always rewards coherence and always punishes noise. They walked away more serious men. The airplane did not move. It had already done the moving.